In 399 BC in Greece, Socrates was executed by democracy simply for asking too many questions. So what about Egypt, Persia, China, Rome, Vietnam, and Africa? Let's hear their stories, many lives, many times. Athens, Greece, 399 BCE, the trial and death of Socrates. Short story, the deciding pebble. Socrates does not recognize the gods of the city. Socrates is poisoning and corrupting the youth. Meletus's sycophantic voice echoed, ricocheting off the courthouse walls, as grating as the screech of metal on stone. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, mine included, were fixed on a shabby old man standing alone in the circle of judgment. But my mind wasn't there. It drifted back to a sweltering afternoon in the agora when I overheard Socrates ask a sculptor, a colleague of mine, "You say you carve a beautiful statue, but what is beauty itself?" That question had lodged itself in my mind ever since. It was like an invisible fissure in the most expensive block of marble. The naked eye couldn't see it, but a stonemason knows that a single misplaced strike of the hammer could shatter the whole thing into 100 pieces. Let me tell you, I am Lycan, a stonemason of Athens. My life is stone, chisel, and hammer. To me, the world needs order, clear rules, like how a straight line cannot bend and a right angle cannot be obtuse. Every day, I seek perfection in every line, turning lifeless blocks of rock into the straight columns of temples and the statues of gods with flawless proportions. Precision is my truth. Our Athens had just staggered out of its darkest years. The Peloponnesian War had taken nearly everything from us. I had seen brothers who never returned from Sicily, seen our proud city walls torn down by the Spartans, and chiseled too many tombstones for families, with no men left. Then came the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants. Our democracy had only just been restored. It was as fragile and vulnerable as a new wall, its mortar still wet. And to rebuild, the foundation must be solid. That foundation was built on faith in our patron gods, absolute respect for the law, and a shared belief in a preordained order. Socrates, with his relentless questions, was like a quarryman, diligently chipping away at the very foundation we were desperately trying to patch up. The men in power feared he was creating a generation of rebels, while common men like me feared his questions would anger the gods and bring their wrath upon Athens once more. I returned to the suffocating reality of the trial. When it was his turn to speak, Socrates did not beg. He didn't weep or bring out his wife and children to appeal to our pity. No, he calmly lectured us. He compared himself to a gadfly, sent by the gods to sting the great but lazy horse of Athens to keep it awake and moving. A fire rose in my chest. We, the citizens who had bled and wept for this city, were being called a lazy horse. He was standing before a court that held his life in its hands, and he chose to be arrogant. That arrogance, to a builder like me, was a contempt for order, for the law, and for the sacrifices of us all. And then, the moment of decision arrived. We were each given 2 pebbles, one solid, one hollow. The solid pebble was for a guilty verdict. I clutched it in my calloused palm. I did not hate Socrates, but I loved Athens more. I feared the chaos his questions could unleash more than I feared an enemy's sword. To protect the still, wet wall of our democracy, I had to remove the man who threatened its foundation. I dropped my pebble into the fateful urn. It was a necessary hammer blow, though I knew it would shatter a masterpiece of creation. Socrates is dead. Athens did seem quieter after that. No one loitered in the market corners anymore, asking questions that unsettled people. I went back to my work, to my stones and my precision. But something had changed forever. Sometimes, while carving a statue, my hand would suddenly stop in mid-air. I would ask myself, what makes a statue beautiful? And the old man's voice would echo in my ear, a relentless whisper. But what is beauty itself, Lycan? I see his students, like Plato, gathering. Their eyes are no longer lost, but burn with a different kind of fire. They are writing down his every word. It seemed that killing Socrates didn't extinguish his questions. On the contrary, it made him a martyr. It made his questions immortal. We had eliminated a man to protect the city's order. But now, in the quiet of Athens, I find myself asking, is an order built on the fear of questions truly an order worth protecting? We craved stability, but did we pay for it with the very soul of Athens, the spirit of inquiry and freedom? And the greatest question that haunts me nightly, the one I now ask you, is this: when you must choose between the safety of a familiar order and a thorny truth that might shatter it, which way will your pebble fall?
Egypt, 399 BCE. Founding of the 29th dynasty. Short story. Dynasty of Dust. They say the Egyptian desert can swallow an entire army. But I, Lycomedes, a veteran mercenary from distant Hellas, have learned that human ambition is the more treacherous quicksand, silently swallowing whole dynasties. I came to this land of pyramids not for the glory of the pharaohs, or the divinity of their animal-headed gods. I came for the glint of silver drachmas. My sword, my shield, my very life, they all have a price. We Greeks were hired by Pharaoh Amyatius to keep his throne secure. But in this dusty military camp, where the barley beer flows stronger than loyalty, I could feel a storm brewing. The rumors spread faster than plague. They trickled from the native Egyptian soldiers, snaked through the ranks of Libyan mercenaries, and finally reached our ears in a garbled pidgin. They spoke of Nepherites, a general in Men's, a pure-blooded Egyptian who was gathering forces. I saw the worry etched deep into the faces of the Egyptian commanders. My countrymen. They just scoffed, went back to their dice, and argued over whose sword was sharper. To them, it didn't matter who sat on the throne, as long as he paid on time. But I was different. I've seen too many city-states fall, too many kings driven into exile. I know that when the winds change, hired swords like us are the first to be swept away. The order to march came as swift as an arrow. My unit was dispatched toward Men's to crush the rebellion. But on the blistering march, under the sun of Ra, all I saw was an army dissolving from within. Soldiers deserted in the night, leaving behind single sets of footprints in the sand before vanishing. Rations dwindled, and water became more precious than gold. The rot was more terrifying than any enemy. One evening, I shared a piece of dry bread with an old Egyptian soldier named Bak. He wasn't a professional warrior like me. His hands were rough, calloused more from years holding a plow than a spear. He pointed to the stars, his voice low and sad. Our pharaoh has forgotten his people, he told me. He builds temples in size, while the Persians still threaten our borders. We need an Egyptian, someone who understands the heart of this land. He spoke of Nepherites with a glimmer of hope in his weary eyes. Bak's words cut me like a knife. Who was I fighting to protect? A foreign king I had never even met. To fight against whom? A general heralded as a savior by his own people. What was the loyalty I was selling truly worth? The battle erupted without fanfare, just screams and the harsh clang of metal on metal. We Greek hoplites formed a textbook wall of shields. But we quickly realized we were on the losing side, Nephrites' men fought like lions defending their pride. They had more than weapons, they had belief. In the chaos, I came face to face with a massive warrior. His round shield, the way he held his spear, I knew instantly he was another Greek. For a split second, we both froze. Through the slit of my helmet, I looked directly into his eyes. I saw no enemy, no hatred, only a weary reflection of myself. We were both strangers, selling our blood in a foreign land for a conflict that was not our own. We quietly lowered our weapons, slipped past each other, and charged into other meaningless duels. Pharaoh Amyatius lost. He was captured and executed in Memphis. Nephrites one ascended the throne, founding the 29th dynasty. The capital was moved to Menz itself. Everything changed in the blink of an eye. A few days later, an officer of the new pharaoh came to our camp. He made an offer. Nephrites also needed experienced warriors to consolidate his power and guard against the Persians. The price was even better than before. My countrymen cheered. Our loyalty was bought with silver, and the silver of Nephrites glittered just as brightly as that of Amyatius. I stood in the ranks, watching the new coins being passed out, and let out a long, bitter sigh. To the rulers, we are tools. To us, they are merely paymasters. Dynasties change their names, kings and generals are replaced, and when mercenaries die, more are hired. It seemed everyone was just trying to play their part well in the gods' great game, begging for a few moments of glory in their short lives. Suddenly, I remembered the stories I'd heard back in Athens about a man, sometimes called a madman, sometimes a sage. That evening, I stood alone, watching the sun sink into the desert, as red as a bleeding wound. My hand clutched a cold drachma. We sell our strength for silver and gold, but is there any gold that can buy true loyalty? And when the dust settles and the dynasties fall, what remains of the wars that were never truly ours to fight? Perhaps, in the end, we are all just mercenaries in our own lives, fighting for causes we don't even fully understand.
Persian Empire, Mesopotamia, 399 BCE. 2 years after the Battle of Cunaxa, and the Greek 10,000. Short story, the empire's wound healer. Some wounds heal with time, and some scars tell a story forever. My hands gently smoothed a layer of aromatic salve over the long scar on General Satabarzaines's chest. It had long since healed, a silvery white line stark against his skin, weathered by desert sun and wind. But whenever the weather turned, it ached, like a memory demanding to be heard. I am Arash, a physician from the great city of Babylon. My work is to soothe pain, to mend what has been torn in the human body. But this scar, it spoke not just of a single battle, but of an empire questioning its own strength. "Still from that Greek spear, my lord?" I asked softly. The general did not answer, only nodded slightly, his gaze distant as he watched the sunset stain the Euphrates red. That spear, and the men who wielded them, had become our silent obsession. 2 years have passed, yet the acrid smell of blood and dust from Cunaxa still seems to haunt me whenever I close my eyes. I was there, in the hastily erected medical tents, amidst the groans of thousands of Persian soldiers. The most horrific sight was not the gaping wounds, but the realization that so many were inflicted by other Persians who had no desire to fight. The empire was bleeding itself dry. We physicians rushed through the chaos, trying to snatch lives from the grasp of death, not daring to ask if the man we were saving had fought for the rightful king, Artaxerxes II, or for the challenger to the throne, Prince Cyrus the Younger. It was a river of blood shed between two brothers and their loyal subjects, a pain that cut deeper than any blade. I have 2 sons of my own, And what could be more heart-wrenching than to see them draw swords against each other? Then they were brought in, the Greek prisoners. For the first time in my life, I saw these strangers from the West with my own eyes. They were formidable, even in chains, even covered in wounds. They stood tall. There were no wretched cries, no whimpered pleas. They endured in silence as I cleansed their wounds. I will never forget a young soldier with an arrow through his calf. As I pulled it out, he only clenched his jaw, his forehead beaded with sweat, but his brilliant blue eyes stared directly into mine, clear and defiant. They seemed carved from a different kind of stone. Their bodies were hard, their discipline an invisible wall. I used willow leaves to dull the pain and honey to disinfect, remedies that had healed generations of Mesopotamians. But as I treated them, I felt I was not just mending a body, but trying to understand a foreign spirit, an iron will I had never before encountered. Then Cyrus died, the rebellion was over. We thought it was finished. We were wrong. Those prisoners, that mercenary army, they did not break, they did not surrender. News began to trickle back to Babylon with the merchant caravans and the patrol scouts. 10,000 Greeks, lost in the heart of the most powerful empire in the world, were fighting their way home. They crossed deep rivers, climbed snow-capped mountains, and defeated the armies sent to stop them. They were like a river flowing backward, a sharp knife slicing a long, painful wound across the map of our empire. The 10,000, a name whispered in every market and on every street corner with a mixture of fear and awe. I often wonder what drove them. We have an empire that stretches from India to Egypt. We have gold, magnificent cities, and an army of 1 million men to protect the great king's order. But those 10,000 Greeks, what did they have besides their spears and their will? Perhaps they possessed something we were slowly losing, a reason to go home. They were not fighting for a king or for conquered land. They were fighting for themselves, for the homes and the freedom that awaited them at the end of an impossible journey. The general's scar was bandaged. He pulled his robe back on and left in silence. I stood alone, watching the first stars begin to glitter in the Babylonian sky. My job is to heal, but I realize there are wounds far deeper than the flesh. The body can be mended. But what of the wound in the soul of an empire? When a foreign army can march through our heartland unopposed, is that not a symptom of a deeper injury, one that no physician can ever hope to cure?
China, 399 BCE, the Tripartition of Jin, and the beginnings of the Warring States period. Short story, the sinner of ink and paper. Men used swords and spears to conquer a country. As for me, I killed my homeland with only a brush and a goatskin scroll. Blood was not shed from a blade, but seeped from the dark strokes of ink. I am Moran, a scribe in the city of Gupang, and I am the one who drew the border that split the heart of the state of Jin. Do not be so quick to judge me. 4 years ago, like any other ambitious young man, I dreamt of glory. I had grown weary of the musty decay of the old bamboo slips, a smell that mirrored the rot of the Jin court itself. Power belonged to those who knew only of bloodlines, while talented men like me withered away in the dark corners of the archives, copying soulless texts day after day. Then the House of Han arrived. They were like a great wind, blowing away the stagnant dust that coated the city gates. They spoke not of lineage, but of talent. They did not want empty words. They wanted men who could get things done. And I, with my calligraphy that was said to dance like a dragon in flight, and a memory that could recite every land register by heart, caught the eye of the Grand Marshal. For the first time in my life, I felt the brush in my hand carry the weight of 1,000 catties. I believed I was serving a better future, a new order that was more efficient, and I deluded myself with this thought. The secret task was given to me on a rainy night. The archive room was cold, the candlelight dancing on mountains of bamboo slips. Outside, thunder cracked like war drums, while inside, there was only the sound of my own breath and the musty scent of the past. The Grand Marshal spread a large goatskin across the table, his voice low and sharp. "Mo Ran, the future of Han rests on the strokes of your brush. Redraw the maps, redefine the registries. What once belonged to Jin will, from this day forward, belong to Han." My heart pounded. All around me was the legacy of hundreds of years of history, the old, yellowed maps and land scrolls, written by generations of scribes. They breathed with the scent of time and memory. My hand brushed over familiar names, a hill, a river, a village I had visited with my father as a child, and then I picked up the brush. The jet-black ink from my brush slithered across the goatskin, as cold and final as a sword's cut. I drew a straight line, dividing a river from which two villages on opposite banks had always drawn water. I struck out the name Jinyuan Prefecture and replaced it with Shangdang Commandery of Han. The scratching of my brush on the goatskin in the dead of night became the most horrifying sound I had ever heard. For a moment, I felt like a god, with the power to decide the fate of mountains and villages. But when the final stroke of ink dried, that feeling was replaced by a chilling emptiness. The new map was perfect, clear, and soulless. It was the brilliant work of a talented scribe, and a death sentence for a land of memories. I was promoted, rewarded. I was promoted, rewarded. I wore fine silks and walked the corridors of power I had once only dreamed of. But then, the ghosts born from my ink began to find me. I saw guard posts with the banners of Han erected on the very roads I had drawn. I heard whispers of families whose ancestral tombs were on one side of the border, but whose fields were on the other, forcing them to be interrogated each day they went to work their land. The breaking point came on a bleak winter afternoon. An old farmer came to my residence, a thin man, his back bent like a question mark. His trembling hands held out a bamboo slip that had aged to the color of honey, the deed to his family's land, passed down from his grandfather. "Sir," his voice cracked, "they say the ancestral field of my family is now public land of Han. They say the records have been written so. I beg you, look again." I took the bamboo slip, my heart feeling as if it were being squeezed in a vise. I had my assistants check the new registries, the very volumes I had compiled. And then I saw it, his plot of land, right on the edge of the new boundary, had been absorbed into public lands with a single stroke of my brush to round out the borders. Below it was my signature and my seal, as deep red as a bloodstain. I looked up into the old man's desperate eyes, and for the first time, I could not bear to look at my own handwriting. That night, I stood on the walls of Gupang, looking down at the land I had redrawn. The distant, flickering lights of the villages looked like lost stars. I had thought I was merely rearranging lines and characters, but I was not. I was rearranging the fates of men. I had torn apart the invisible bonds woven by history, kinship, and custom. They say history is written by the victors, but what of those who hold the pen to write it? Are we tools of our time, or do we shape it ourselves? I looked at my fingers, still stained with the scent of fine ink. This hand has never held a sword, but its crime, perhaps, is far heavier. And when a line you draw on paper shatters another person's life, are you still an innocent chronicler, or have you become a silent executioner?
Italy, Rome, 399 BCE, 3 years before Rome captures Veii. Short story, The Seventh Notch. The piece of wood in my hand now has 6 notches, one for each winter away from home. Today, as the November drizzle began to soak its cold into my worn wool cloak, I slowly carved the 7th. For 7 years I have stared at the silent, arrogant stone walls of Veii, watching them through the skin-burning summer sun, the autumn mud, and the bone-chilling frost of winter nights. The patricians in the Senate call this a duty to Rome. I, Aulus Virginius, a landless farmer, call it a price. The price for a meager wage and for a promise more distant than the horizon. Before I became a soldier, my hands were more familiar with the handle of a hoe than the hilt of a sword. I had a small plot of land, enough to feed my wife and son. But then came a failed harvest, a debt I could not repay, and my ancestral land fell into the hands of a fat nobleman. The only path left for a penniless commoner was to put on this uniform. The war with Veii was the first in history, they said, where we soldiers were paid 3 AES a day. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep my wife from begging, enough for my son to have bread. That is the only reason I am still here, in this muddy camp where our greatest enemy is not the Etruscan soldiers, but the winter and the fevers. Life drifted on in boredom and despair until one day, a tribune of the plebs came from Rome to visit the camp. He was not like the generals who only screamed about discipline. He walked among us, the common soldiers, grasped our calloused hands, and spoke of a different future. He said this war was not just for the glory of Rome. For the first time, I heard an idea that was insane yet intoxicating. If Veii fell, its rich and fertile lands would not belong to the nobility, but would be divided among the very soldiers who shed their blood to conquer it. A spark of hope flickered in the damp military camp. But hope, like fire, needs fuel to burn. Lucius, my tent mate, scoffed. "Aulus," he said, his voice hoarse from cheap wine, "do you believe the words of a politician? They just toss us a bone to keep us tearing at the enemy for them." An argument broke out. Half believed this was a chance to change their lives. The other half thought it was just a lie. I stood between the two sides. I had lost my faith in the nobility, yet I yearned to believe in this promise. That night, I could not sleep. I overheard the centurion talking. He said that paying us was a strategic move. It allowed Rome to maintain a year-round siege, choking Veii to death, something unprecedented. Destroying Veii would eliminate their greatest rival, making Rome the master of all Latium, nearly doubling its territory. Suddenly I understood. We were not just hired soldiers, we were cogs in a colossal war machine, a machine that was becoming professional. And the promise of land was the oil that kept that machine running smoothly. The next day, I did something I had never dared before. I volunteered for a night reconnaissance patrol, a near-suicidal mission. Lucius looked at me as if I were mad. But I did not do it for courage or for some empty glory. I did it because I had to see the prize they had promised with my own eyes. We crawled through abandoned fields under a dim moon. The earth beneath my hands was damp and loose. I could smell its fertility, a scent a farmer never forgets. I saw vineyards and olive groves, all carefully tended before the war began. This land was 10 times richer than the barren plot I had lost. A powerful feeling rose in me, not greed, but a conviction. Every inch of Veii's land I scouted, I saw as a potential inch of my son's future. In that moment in my mind, this land no longer belonged to the enemy. It was the prize, it was the spoils. I returned to camp safely at dawn, carrying not just information about the enemy's defenses, but also an ironclad belief. I sat down by the campfire, looking at the few coins of my pay in my palm, then looked up again at those city walls. Lucius said nothing, just handed me a wineskin. I took a long drink. The wine was harsh, but it could not wash away the taste of hope sprouting inside me. I had my answer. I would stay, I would fight, not for the empty words of the senators, nor for the glory of Rome. I fight for the land behind those walls. They had turned us from dispossessed farmers into professional conquerors. They paid us to kill and to take land. We were fighting to solve an injustice at home by creating a greater injustice somewhere else. I stared into the flickering flames, and a question crept into my mind, a question colder than the night dew. When this war is over, when Veii is nothing but ashes and I return to my new land, will I have become the very nobleman I once hated?
India, 399 BCE, after the Buddha's Parinirvana, about 1 year earlier. Short story, The City Guard and the Promise Under the Bodhi Tree, Part 1. This wall is my truth. For 30 years, this spear and I have watched countless suns rise and set over the walls of Shravasti. People search for truth in scriptures, in whispered prayers in the monasteries. My truth, however, lies here, upon these cold, solid stones. It is a simple truth. Only strength and iron discipline bring peace. The Buddha Gautama entered nirvana some years ago. His teachings are like a gentle wind, seeping into every corner of this capital city. They speak of compassion, of impermanence, of the path to ending suffering. I listen, but I do not believe. I have seen blood spilled on the borders of the Kosala kingdom. I have seen the cruelty in the eyes of invaders and the greed in the eyes of thieves. To me, those teachings are too soft, too fanciful for a reality built on swords and laws. This wall, this spear, these are the tangible things that protect the people from suffering, not empty words. Part 2. The Young Thief and the Whisper from the Monastery. Then one day, my truth was challenged, not by an invading army, but by a skinny boy with eyes as panicked as a small animal cornered. I caught him trying to steal a sack of barley from the military stores. According to the law, his hand would be forfeit. I had escorted countless men like him, and my heart had never stirred. Discipline was discipline. But his mother came and knelt at my feet. She did not beg me to spare her son. She made only a strange request. Sir Guard, before my son receives his punishment, please allow me to go to the Jetavana monastery. I wish to hear the words of the Blessed One again, to find some peace. Curiosity, and perhaps a touch of contempt, made me agree. I escorted her myself to make sure she attempted no tricks. The Jetavana monastery was unusually quiet. There was no clang of weapons, only the faint scent of incense and the rustling of leaves. I stood under a sal tree, my eyes still fixed on the woman, but my ears unintentionally caught a monk recounting a story to some followers. It was the story of Angulimala, the bandit who had murdered 999 people, a man feared even by armies. And yet, the Buddha had faced him alone and transformed him with nothing but words. With words, he had extinguished the fire of hatred and turned a butcher into a saint. Part 3, which is heavier, the sword or compassion. The story struck my mind like an invisible hammer. A mass murderer could be redeemed. Words could be more powerful than 1,000 swords. That night, on my familiar watchtower, the spear in my hand felt heavy for the first time. The city wall was no longer an unshakable truth, but a prison that confined my own perspective. I looked down at the sleeping city. The insects chirp. I tried to cling to the ironclad logic that had guided me for 30 years. But the image of the bandit Angulimala bowing before the Buddha and the mother's tearful eyes intertwined, tormenting my mind. The sword at my hip, the one that had taken so many lives to protect others, suddenly felt meaningless. I asked myself, does brutal punishment truly extinguish evil, or does it only sow the seeds of hatred for a future life? Between upholding the law and saving a soul, what is the true duty of a guard? Part 4. The Promise Under the Bodhi Tree. The next morning, the sun rose as always, but something inside me had changed. I did not take the young thief to the execution ground. I brought him before my commanding officer. For the first time in my life, My words were not those of obedience. I asked to take responsibility, to vouch for him. I proposed a different punishment. Let him serve in the army, under my personal supervision. The officer looked at me as if I were mad, but perhaps my many years of loyal service had earned me the right to be mad for once. He agreed. I did not take the boy home. I led him to an ancient Bodhi tree in a corner of the city. Under its lush green canopy, I told him the story of Angulimala. I do not know if the Buddha's teachings are the absolute truth, I said, my voice hoarse. But I know this: punishing a wrongdoer is easy. Transforming a person is 1,000 times harder. For 30 years, this sword has defended the city wall, but it has never defended a single soul. Today, with you, I want to try a different path. They say that after the Buddha passed away, his teachings would endure forever. I once thought that was an empty saying, but now I understand. Perhaps those teachings are not found only in scriptures or chants. They are found in every choice we make, every time we stand on the line between punishment and forgiveness, between hatred and compassion, between destroying and nurturing. And you, if you held the power to decide another's fate, would you choose to be a stern judge or the one who offers a second chance?
Southeast Asia, Vietnam, 399 BCE. The Đông Sơn culture at its height. Short story, The Curse and the Drum. Have you ever heard the river whisper? I have. Night after night, when the fire in the forge has died to embers, I hear the river murmuring its stories, telling of the lives it has embraced and the human debts that must be paid. I am a bronze caster in this land of Đông Sơn, and my story begins with the fire that took my father, leaving me a legacy of bronze and a curse of water. That night, the flames in the foundry danced a wild dance. I still remember the acrid smell of burning clay and the furious hiss of molten metal. My father, the most gifted artisan in our village, fell beside the cauldron of boiling bronze. A slip of the foot, people said, but the elders shook their heads. They said the river god was angry because my father had dared to cast a drum with a sun motif that was too large, an arrogant challenge to the power of water. That curse clung to my family's workshop and to my own 18-year-old shoulders, weighing more than the heaviest bronze drum. I took over the workshop in silence, under a cloud of doubtful stares. My father's shadow was immense, and his legacy was a haunting one. The words of Old Man Tun, the village veteran craftsman, constantly echoed in my ears. The boy is still wet behind the ears. His hands only know small hammers. How can he tend to this sacred forge? The river has already chosen your father. Do not try to fight fate. His words were like knives, carving into my pride. The life of a bronze caster like us is a symphony of earth, water, fire, and metal. It is not just manual labor. It is an art, a secret rite. We had to journey upstream to find ores of copper and lead, then mix them according to a secret ratio passed down from father to son. Then came the creation of the mold, the vessel that would shape the work's soul. The drum mold had to be made of clay mixed with rice husks, consisting of 3 parts: an inner piece, an outer piece, and the core between them. On the outer piece, we used rollers and stamps to carve intricate patterns. Flocks of black birds flying around the sun, dancing warriors, boats carrying people across the waves. Each pattern was a prayer, a story for the entire tribe. Old Man Tun's contempt and the pain of my father's loss forged an iron will within me. I would cast the greatest bronze drum ever made, a drum whose sound would carry all the way to the river's source, as clear as the song of a morning bird. I would offer it to the river god, not in supplication, but to prove that the fire in the bloodline of this drum maker had never been extinguished. To prepare for the fateful casting, I cleaned out the oldest corners of the workshop. And there, in a cobweb-filled nook, I found a small wooden chest that had belonged to my father. Inside was not gold or silver, but old goatskin scrolls and a broken piece of a fired clay mold, a fragment from his final casting. I was about to throw it away, but a small detail caught my eye. On the curved surface of the clay, next to the familiar patterns of deer, were several strange symbols I had never seen before. They were not writing, nor were they decorative. I compared them to my father's goatskin scrolls. For a whole week, I immersed myself in his drawings and scribbled notes. Then, one moonless night, the truth flashed like lightning. The strange symbols on the mold fragment matched a detailed diagram in one of the scrolls. They were not a spell, but a formula, a recipe for a new alloy, with a proportion of lead and tin completely different from the traditional method. My father believed this ratio would make the alloy more fluid, allowing it to flow more evenly into the fine grooves of the patterns. And most importantly, would create a sound more vibrant and resonant than any drum before it. My father's accident was not a curse. It was a risk taken during a great experiment. He had been too close to the furnace to observe the flow of the metal, and a small splash of molten alloy had made him lose his balance. I went to Old Man Tun and placed the broken fragment on his table. He looked at it, then at me, his eyes unable to hide his confusion and guilt. He had been there, he had seen everything. But he had remained silent. His silence had turned a tragic accident into a cruel curse, spreading fear throughout the village and drowning me in despair. I did not need an apology. The sweetest revenge was to complete my father's final wish. I lit the forge again this time. The flames were not an enemy, but an ally. I mixed the alloy myself according to the new formula, my heart pounding with every hammer strike. The amber-colored stream of molten metal was poured into the mold as the whole workshop held its breath. On the day the drum was born, I had it carried to the center of the village square. It was perfect. The sun at its center radiated powerful rays, and the flock of blackbirds spread their wings in a proud circle. Before the eyes of the entire village, and of Old Man Tun, who stood silently in a corner, I took the wooden mallet, drew a deep breath, and struck the first note. Boom! The sound was not an angry roar like thunder, but clear, majestic, and strangely resonant. It flew over the thatched roofs, skimmed across the surface of the lazily flowing Ma River, echoed against the cliffs, and returned. Everyone was stunned. That sound had a powerful life to it. It did not speak of death or punishment, but of aspiration, of humanity's endless creativity. Old Man Tun bowed his head, a single tear rolling down his wrinkled cheek. The curse, if there ever was one, was truly broken. I stood there, looking at the bronze face of the drum reflecting the whole sky. It turned out the most frightening curses come not from gods or rivers, but from the fear and ignorance within the human mind. We are always trying to decode the mysteries of the world, but sometimes, the greatest mystery lies in the things we do every day. Could it be that the greatest legacy one can leave is not a collection of glittering objects, but the courage to face the truth and pursue one's passion to the very end? The sound of the drum still echoed, and I knew it was my father's answer from the world beyond.
Sicily, Carthage, 399 BCE. 1 year before Dionysios' One's War and innovations in military technology. Short story, The Legacy of Stone and Bowstring. Dionysios promised me gold and glory. I have both now. But every night when I close my eyes, I see the ghosts my weapons have made. I am Damon, an engineer from Corinth, and I sold my soul to the tyrant of Syracuse in exchange for a singular opportunity, complete creative freedom. Our workshop is isolated on the island of Ortygia, the heart of Dionysios' power, guarded more securely than the treasury. The air here is always thick with the smell of cedar wood, of burnt metal, and the sweat of hundreds of the finest craftsmen in the Greek world. We came from everywhere, drawn by the promises of Dionysios like moths to a flame. The day I left Corinth, I told myself I was using my talents to serve the great cause of the Greeks, to fight our ancestral enemy, Carthage. Now surrounded by blueprints and models, I am no longer so sure. I live and breathe my machines. By day, I command the craftsmen, their hammers and chisels composing my own private symphony. At night, under the flickering oil lamps, I continue to sketch, to calculate, to find ways for these wooden arms to throw farther harder. We have perfected the gastrophetes, the belly bow with its terrifying penetrating power. And we are building the first quinqueremes, warships with 5 banks of oars. But my greatest pride and my deepest horror is the stone thrower, the lithobolos, a giant stone throwing machine the world has never seen. On the day of its first test, the entire island seemed to hold its breath. Dionysios and his generals stood on a high platform, while I stood beside my creation, feeling the tension in every timber under the strain of tightly wound cow sinew. When I gave the signal, the soldiers turned the winches, their creaking like the groans of a monster about to be unleashed. Then a sharp, deadly thud, a stone the weight of a grown man shot through the air, drawing a perfect arc, before it slammed into a replica stone wall, hundreds of yards away. Dust and debris exploded when it settled. A gaping hole was torn in the wall. A roar of cheers erupted. The generals slapped each other on the back, while Dionysios looked at me with the blazing eyes of a conqueror who had found his sword. For a moment, my own chest swelled with pride. I had done it. I had turned the laws of physics into a god of war. But then, that pride began to crack. A few weeks later, I saw squads of young Syracuse soldiers, their faces still smooth as milk, being trained to operate the machine. Among them was Elpidos, my neighbor's son. The boy looked at me, his eyes bright with admiration, and shouted, "Master Daumon, your machine is magnificent. With it, we will crush the Carthaginians." His smile was like a knife in my heart. I suddenly realized that my weapons were not just numbers, blueprints, and principles. They were tools lubricated with the blood of boys like Elpidos, and of other nameless boys on the other side of the sea. Destruction was no longer an abstract concept. It had the face of Elpidos. I also began to hear the complaints in the taverns about the ever-increasing war taxes, about families forced from their land. To make way for new fortifications, to feed the war machine I was helping to create, all of Syracuse was groaning under the cost. Yesterday, Dionysios came to inspect the workshop. He placed a hand on my shoulder, the cold of his armor seeping through my tunic. "Daumon," he said, his voice full of satisfaction, "you are a treasure of Syracuse. History will remember your name next to mine." I felt only a chilling coldness. I did not reply, only stared silently out at the great sea, toward distant Carthage. I knew I had helped open a new, bloodier chapter in warfare, one where men could kill each other from a distance, without ever seeing their enemy's face. We humans always long to create, to push beyond our limits. But is there a point where we should stop? When does our creativity become a curse upon humanity itself? What is the fragile line between progress and destruction? Will men, more than 2,000 years from now, invent machines that can fire across entire nations? And will tyrants still exist to command them?
West Africa, 399 BCE, the Nok culture and iron-smelting technology. Short story, Koro's tale, stone chips and hot iron. My hands are calloused by stone, a lifetime companion to stone. But now, the familiar sound of rock striking rock is slowly fading into memory. My village is no longer quiet. Instead, the growl of the fire and the ring of the iron anvil echo through the valley, a sound that is harsh, powerful, and foreign, like the beat of a hot, metal heart. I sit in my workshop, trying to finish a fine stone axe. Every tap is the distilled experience of 50 harvests. But I cannot concentrate. From the other end of the village, the forge of the boy, Amati rings without end. The sound of his hammer on red-hot iron feels like blows striking directly at my pride. Frustrated, I put down the river stone I use for grinding. The dry clack, it makes sounds mournful. All my life, I have believed that every stone has a spirit. To create a good tool, the craftsman must listen, must feel the breath of the mountain hidden in every grain of the stone. The villagers have used my tools to hunt, to build their homes, to cultivate their fields. Seeing them trusted and used, I felt myself to be an inseparable part of this community. But that pride has been shaken. Just yesterday, a group of young hunters came to me, but not to order a new stone spearhead. The young man, Ojo, held out a bent iron spear tip. "Uncle Koro, can you see if you can fix this for us? This iron tip is very good, much stronger than stone." My ears were ringing, stronger than stone. I dismissed them with a wave of my hand. I do not work with that hot-tempered black metal. It has no soul. Take it to your Amati. I saw the disappointment in their eyes. But the wound to my own pride was deeper. Had they forgotten that my stone spearheads had fed this tribe for generations? That afternoon, Amati came to see me. He has always been respectful, a boy with bright eyes and a gentle smile. He brought a small, well-forged iron knife. "A gift for you, Uncle Koro. This blade is sharp. It will help you carve the small details on your stones better." I looked at the knife, the cold, dark metal in my calloused palm. It was sharp, it was strong, but in my eyes, it was soulless. I handed it back. "Thank you, but I am used to my own tools." Watching Amati's back as he walked away, I felt a loneliness I had never known. And then, the fury of the heavens broke loose. One afternoon, the storm howled and rain fell in sheets. In the middle of the night, a loud crack echoed through the village, followed by screams. A large section of the roof on our main grain storehouse had collapsed. If we did not fix it in time, the entire reserve of millet and beans for the coming season would be ruined. Under the pouring rain, my stone axes, the pride of the village, were now useless. They chipped away at the wet wood, making only slow, shallow cuts. Desperation was clear on every face. It was then that Amati and his smiths appeared, carrying newly forged iron axes, their blades gleaming in the torchlight. The sound of their chopping was sharp and powerful, cutting through the roar of the rain. The trees came down with a crash. In a fraction of the time, they had felled all the timber we needed. I stood there in the freezing rain, and the stone axe in my hand suddenly felt heavy and out of place. For the first time in my life's work felt meaningless. The next morning, the rain had stopped. I did not go back to my workshop, but walked aimlessly toward the end of the village. The smell of charcoal and metal guided my steps to Amati's forge. Seeing me, he stopped his hammering. I said nothing, walked to a pile of scrap, and picked up a leftover piece of iron. I sat down and pulled a small, sharp flint flake from my pouch, the detail tool I always carried. I began to tap. I did not try to forge it. I used my life skill, the art of carving stone, to shape the piece of metal. Tap by tap, I etched the image of an eagle with its wings spread. Strangely, the metal I had called soulless yielded obediently under my hands, holding every line faithfully and permanently. When the sun was high overhead, a small but vivid iron eagle lay in my palm. Only then did I realize a craftsman's skill is not in the stone or the iron. It is in the hands and the mind. The soul of a work comes not from the material, but from its maker. I looked up at Amati and held out the iron bird to him. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. "Thank you for showing me that stone and iron, they can fly together. Perhaps change is not the end of the old ways, but a new beginning, a chance for the spirit of the past to be reborn in a new form. Are we sometimes so afraid of the new that we forget it is our hands and minds that create value, not the material itself? What do you think?"